Hello and welcome. So, to get started with Spring, the first question that you most certainly have is, hey, what is Spring and why do we need it? Now, the official definition is something like this. The Spring Framework provides a comprehensive programming and configuration model for modern Java-based enterprise application on any kind of development platform. A key element of Spring is infrastructural support at the application level. Spring focuses on the plumbing of enterprise applications so that teams can focus on application level business logic without unnecessary ties to specific deployment environments. Now, tell me honestly, did you understand anything? Probably not, because there are lots of fancy words, a lot of buzzwords, and I will tell you, and let's take it step by step. So let's imagine that you have a basic Java application, and your application has something like this. Has like a class that you have a list of collection of people, and these people you are getting from the database. Doesn't matter what database, but you are just getting from the database. Now, after this class, which is responsible for getting your data, then you have like another class, let's say a class of people service. And this service is responsible of getting all the collections of data from your people DAO class, and then do some processing, some logic to that specific collection, and then return it with whoever calls the method. Now, after this, you have like a controller, and this controller will call the get people from the people service, so you can display it on the UI console. Doesn't matter. And let's say you have like a main method, and for you to call the method in people controller get people, you will need to have all this necessary configuration. So you will need to create a new instance of people controller, but people controller, the functionality of the people controller class is dependent on the people service class. So you will also need to create a new instance of people service. And the functionality of people service is dependent on the people DAO. So you also need to create a new instance of people DAO. And you will need to create all these necessary objects to just call this simple method. Now, let's take it on the next level of complexity. Let's say that you have another service, and that specific service also needs the list of people from your DAO. Now let's imagine that in your people controller class you are changing the collection, and in your other service you want the same collection that it's been changed. So you also need to do a lot of configuration to have just some simple logic in your application. And this is pretty common when you develop Java application. And that's why Spring comes to help, because Spring has these two principles, or these two elements, the dependency injection and the version of control. We will learn about this, and basically wants to make your life easier as a developer. So you can focus only on your methods and only on your business logic, and leave Spring do the rest. Now we will dive deep into another video about this, but for now I've just given you why is Spring is needed, and that's the first motive. Now let's take it a step ahead, and let's say your awesome app, you want to build it, but now in modern technology your app needs to have several other integration, because your app probably you don't want to be like a desktop application, you want to be like a web based application. So it most certainly will need a server. So to do this you will need to install a server, something like Tomcat. You will need to build your application, build your jar files, and deploy to this Tomcat so it can run it. Then let's say you want your application to have a database. Without data you cannot have an application, and database is pretty common these days. So you'll also need to integrate your application with the database. Now here you have to have other necessary configuration needed to do so your app can safely connect to the database. But what happens if tomorrow you change the database? So you need to do some abstraction and something to connect to your other database, and so on. Now, your application also, you want to connect to the web. So you'll also have to have configuration with this part. And maybe your application, you want to have security, and you also need to configure that. Maybe you want to deploy your application to the cloud, and you also will need to do that. And as you can imagine, all these things, it's pretty common in these days application. And to do just a simple application, you will probably need to spend 90% of your time configuring stuff and 10% doing the actual logic of your application. Now the problem is you are configuring very common scenarios. So that's why Spring comes to help. Besides the fact that Spring has this dependency injection and this inversion of control, Spring has a lot of modules where it does this heavy lifting for you. It does all this configuration, so we can only focus on the business logic. So my simple definition of what Spring is, just with the information that we have right now, is like a framework, which basically a framework means a collection of libraries, of packages, that does the heavy lifting for you. So it does all the configuration, I mean not all, but does, the minimum configuration that you need to build a standalone application, a Java application, a web application, and so on, so you can focus on your custom logic of your application, what your application is trying to achieve. And also it has a lot of modules and a lot of integrations with a lot of libraries, because the Spring is not the only framework out there. We have a lot of libraries in Java, because if you remember, Java is an open source platform, so we can have a lot of libraries and we can integrate our application and depend on other libraries. And the focus of Spring is to do this, to help you to code faster and better, and don't focus too much on all this heavy lifting for you. Now, this is enough to get started. Now let's get started to build our first Spring application.